Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second of the museum's International Year of Biodiversity Harry Butler in the Wild lecture series. For those of you who have not yet picked up a green program, these are available at the front of the museum as you leave this morning. And inside you will be able to see all of the speakers that are coming to Geraldton or any of the other WA museum sites between now and June, and there'll be a second series that will be published in June, which will take us through from July to November. So it is the International Year of Biodiversity, and we're thrilled to be able to promote the work of the WA Museum's speakers. And I'd like to welcome this morning Shirley Slack-Smith. Shirley works in the Aquatic Zoology department. She is the Curator of Molluscs, and she has a long and extensive career in this field, working for universities, museums, and of course has been with the WA Museum for a number of years, researching and working around the world, in fact, with scientists in this area. She has worked with both salt and freshwater molluscs, and more importantly looking at short-range endemic species in times of increasing industrial development such as mining. Her fieldwork has taken her pretty much up and down the whole of the WA coast, including the offshore islands and reefs. And the other countries that she's worked on include those in the Indo-West Pacific region, such as Papua New Guinea and Indonesia, or in the southwest Indian Ocean, such as Madagascar, Mauritius and the Seychelles. So not a bad way to have a career and get some excellent travelling at the same time. Without any further ado, I'd now like to invite Shirley to talk about the marine molluscs of the Central Coast and the Houtman Abrolhos. Thank you, Shirley.
Thank you. One of these days I'm going to go back to some of those places and do it as a holiday so I could actually see the land instead of just the sea. The talk that we've got today is about the central coast of Western Australia. It's about the coastal regions along here from north and south of Geraldton and of the offshore islands that we know so well as the Houtman Abrolhos. The oddball thing about this coast, the central coast is quite regular, as it should be, but the Abrolhos are just an anomaly, sitting out there, the most southerly coral reefs, system of coral reefs that we have. And they're much farther south than anything on the eastern coast. It's just they're oddball things. And so I wanted to think about why they're there in that particular place and why they persist and flourish so well. Is the sound all right? Yeah. Okay. So if you could have the next one. The coast of Western Australia, you know, is very, very long. I've forgotten how many thousands of kilometres long, and even more when you start counting the coasts of the islands offshore, up off the Kimberley, right down through the Pilbara and to Shark Bay, and including the Abrolhos, of course. A lot of that coastline was quite different in the days of the ice ages, which ended about 10,000 years ago, a series of ice ages that ended about 10,000 years ago. And at that time, the shore, because there was so much water bound up in the ice all around the world, the shorelines were out in this area here, what we now call to the edge of the continental shelf. But as the ice began to melt with the change in climate of the whole Earth, then the water started invading the continental shelf and came in and in and in. In some cases, it came much further in than the coastline is now showing, and so we have these large changes in the climate of the Western Australia in general. Apart from the rising sea levels, we have the sea coming up into the deep river valleys, in some of the deep river valleys that were coming out to the coast, sometimes in different directions to the way they now flow. And they were carrying the runoff from the land, not just the water from the ice that was melting around here, and elsewhere, but they were carrying the sediment in those streams, those quickly running streams. And the sediment started to come down, and it built up these areas that we now call the coastal plains, and the big basins that come in here and here, particularly around here and so on. So it filled up those areas and changed them dramatically. With the one thing I perhaps should mention is that when the ice was melting, all this weight was being lifted off. And gradually some of these areas that we call the cratons, like the big craton that's down here, if I could have the next one, started to rise. They actually rose up like corks, that had been relieved of a load on top. So that we have, say, around Perth and further south, the granitic craton that we call the Yilgarn craton is much further. It's bobbed up, but half of it is gone because of the sediment, because of its being abraded by the ice and the sediment flowing down into the oceans and onto the areas that we now call the coastal plains. So that when we look at the climate that we have now, we find it very difficult to reconcile it with the climate that was then and before. It's certainly a much drier climate in general, all over as we know only too well these days. And here in Geraldton on the central coast and inland, we're in this sort of overlap zone between the summer rainfall seasons that we get in the Kimberleys and further south, and the winter rainfalls that we have operating on the southern coast and coming up. And we're sort of there in an overlap zone, so sometimes, as you undoubtedly know better than I do, we'll get rain just in winter, and then sometimes we'll get both winter and summer rains. On the oddball year, we'll only get, we won't get much at all. And because we're in this intermediate zone, we are also intermediate as far as the tidal ranges are concerned. Up in the Kimberleys, as you have probably read, they're very huge tidal ranges, up to about something like 15 metres in many places, 15 feet in many places, and even higher as you go further north. But down south, we've got a tidal range that is very low. It's often only about sort of half a metre, certainly less than a metre at any time, even on the odd occasions when there's very large atmospheric changes driven and the rain and the winds affect the tidal range significantly, so that in Perth certainly, and to a certain extent up as far as Geraldton and such places, the tidal ranges, you'll find that the low tides are mostly in the morning. Nowhere else, or hardly anywhere else in the world, does this occur, this regularity in summer. And it's all to do with the pressure systems and the way they are operating and influencing the tidal sequence that would normally operate. And our tides, as you can see here, might only be 0.3 or 0.8 of a metre, up to about 0.8 of a metre. So that means that the effect on the marine life is that you have only a very small range of rock or whatever, or the beaches, over which the tide moves up and down. You've only got a very small area of intertidal habitats exposed. And I'll mention those later on as we go through the talk. Thank you. But the currents then, in our area here particularly, but right up and down and around the bottom of the Western Australian coast, the thing that seems to be of most influence in what can live where in the sea and in the intertidal areas are the current systems that operate along our coasts. In that way, our coast here in Western Australia is actually quite unique, not just in terms of Australia, but in terms of the world. If I could have the next one, please. This is a very, very diagrammatic picture, and it doesn't show all that I want to show, but I think if you get the general drift, that in the southern hemisphere below the equator, the tides go round in the currents, go round in an anti-clockwise direction in all of the oceans, all the large oceans. Above the equator to the north, they're coming round in a clockwise direction, and so on. And as they come around, for instance, from the Pacific Ocean, they turn around and they'll send water across. It comes across and down the east coast as the South Equatorial Current. But because Australia is separated from the land masses to the north, in the northern hemisphere, the water can get through. It gets through those passages between the islands of New Guinea and the Indonesian islands, and sort of lumps up in this general area here, so that the water level, the actual water level, with this incoming flow of seawater from the Pacific Ocean, is higher there than it is down here. Thank you. And so the next thing that happens is that the water starts to run downhill, literally downhill. And we have this tremendous current that we call the Leeuwin Current, which is rather nice to think it belongs more to Western Australia than it might do with some other name. And it comes down the coast heading southwards. It comes down with some force. It's strongest in winter, because of the way this water heaps up to the north of Australia, and it is of a different consistency to the as it comes south. It cools off, not just because it mixes with the cooler water around it, but simply because it's just losing energy, and it also varies in the nearness or how close it is to the coast. It can move in and out like that. Apart from that, it has these little jets of water that come out, these gyrols, and they move around, and their position and frequency changes with time. Balancing that, before I go any further, balancing that is a current. This picture was taken, the satellite image was taken at a time when the Leeuwin Current was flowing very strongly to the south. But there is this, what we call this countercurrent, that goes northwards, and this countercurrent is driven not by any great accumulation of water down to the south, but simply because of the way the winds blow across the Southern Ocean and up from about Cape Leeuwin and Cape Naturalist northwards. And so it's got much less force behind it, it's much slower flowing and so on, but it is cool to cold water, and it has got a lot more nutrient in it than does this water coming from the tropics. It creeps up along the coast, and I certainly know in Perth that the swimming at Cottesloe is quite a bit different from swimming over at Rottnest Island, because you're going from one water mass to another. And the same would be true here, and it certainly is true even within a short distance of the coast, and it's certainly very different by the time it gets out here. I perhaps should have mentioned, for those that are not familiar with such images, that the colour sort of reflects the temperature of the water, and the brighter the orange, the hotter the water is, and so on. And as it cools off, it becomes yellow and eventually just mixes in with the rest of it. And so what happens is that the Leeuwin Current coming down and being stronger in winter sort of squeezes this countercurrent up close to the shore, but when the Leeuwin Current starts to fade off during the summer months, because of this change of the water levels up north, it moves away from the coast and allows more of this countercurrent. So it's during summer that we find that, in fact, the effect of these cooler waters coming north are so noticeable. Those cooler waters going north go up right up the coast, and they go to about, at their peak of action, they go to round about Northwest Cape. and not any further, as far as we know. Whereas the Leeuwin Current comes down, sometimes it peters out round about Cape Leeuwin, Cape Naturalist, but on other times when it's really flowing strongly, it goes round the corner, across, and so you find at various places along the south coast to the east of Albany, say between Albany and Hopetown, that you get little turtles, marine turtles turning up down there. But what also happens is that it affects the spread of the molluscs and other sea creatures. I know I'm zooming in on molluscs because that's about the only thing I know about, but you could take it for granted that the other sea creatures like the worms and the echinoderms, the sea urchins and the starfish and corals and certainly corals and jellyfish and everything, crabs, all are affected in much the same way as are the molluscs that I'm talking mostly about. Next one, thanks. So when these currents flow, whether they're the ones flowing from the north in the Leeuwin Current, when these waters flow, or when they're coming from the south in the Cape's countercurrent, they're carrying the plankton. And plankton is of two different sorts. There are animals, organisms, plants and animals that are planktonic animals that just live in the water column all their lives, and that's their habitat. And they go with the currents, of course, or any other water disturbance that might occur. But some of the members of the planktonic community, animals and plants, are the early stages, the eggs, the sperm, the fertilised eggs, the larvae, and some of the the larval stages up to about the time when they're turning into juvenile organisms. They are carried in the current as well. And it's for that reason that we have the difference, because we have the different water currents and the different temperatures from the Abrolhos to the coastal areas here at Geraldton, that we have the different animals living in it, in those places. And of course, to have that system working and carrying those larvae, those eggs and those larvae from one place to another, the current system, the working of the current systems must be synchronised or must be appropriate to the breeding seasons of those animals. Right, next one, thanks. So we have along the central coast, we have a range of habitats, and I'll just go through a few of the characteristics of them, just so that you see, probably you're already aware of how different the Abrolhos is to the coastal areas. So most of the coastal areas, we have this beautifully white sand, mostly formed by from the decay of the limestone that is a remnant of the old dune systems that were immensely tall, immensely high at their peak before the ice ages finished. And because of the weight of that sand pressing down, and because of the water running through the dunes and so on, the sands underneath were crushed and changed into limestone. And so when those dunes blew away, or at least most of them are blown away, some of them, as you well know, are down the coast, and you can still see them beautifully from the air, as I saw the other day. But the limestone that's around is mostly formed from those dunes. Sometimes it has had fossils because the shells have been blown up on the beaches even that long ago, and so it's been incorporated in the limestone, and quite a few of the limestone areas along the coast do show a considerable density of fossils. You can see some of them in the displays in the area outside. But the beaches tend to be calm and clear, and the reason they're relatively calm is because of these limestone, just like the limestone here, these limestone reefs that occur running along the coast completely or in broken pieces, but there are a series of them going out from shallower to deeper water running roughly parallel to the coasts as they now exist. And so in between those reef systems, you have fairly shallow waters, which are relatively still and not often affected by heavy wave action. And so it provides a remarkable area, a considerable area going well out off the coast for seagrasses and such to grow. Next one, thanks. And sometimes in some places along this coast, these seagrass beds are extremely dense. As you can see, it's just a single species in this particular case. In other places, sometimes there are different species. And these seagrasses are incredibly important to the lives of the creatures, of a lot of the creatures that live in these areas, whether they're living there temporarily or whether they're living there permanently. We call them nursery areas because the eggs, the larvae, the juveniles get tremendous amount of shelter in among this type of seagrass bed and most of the other seagrasses as well. And because it takes, even though the waves might at times be very strong, it doesn't greatly disturb the water right down near the roots of the seagrasses. Apart from that, the seagrasses do provide food for herbivorous animals. Mostly the actual seagrass itself, the leaf isn't eaten, it's the sponge that's on the outside. If you touch these seagrass leaves, they'll feel slippery and slimy, and that's because of diatoms and bacteria and things like this, and filamentous algae that are growing on the leaves. And a lot of the creatures that live on these leaves are just going along, rasping off that layer, and that's their food, which of course is plant food. Thank you. But over in the Abrolhos, we have a different system. We do have sheltered waters there, of course, as well. But they're mostly within the lagoons. The coral reefs generally around a periphery, and there's deeper water, quite clear water usually, and it's relatively wave-free, considering what the waves are like outside the coral reefs, and so on. And it's in those areas that we find quite a lot of the species of molluscs and other creatures that are not present outside where the water is much more turbulent. Thank you. The coral reefs, of course, there on the Abrolhos, as they do elsewhere, they can either be huge accumulations of coral, such as this Acropora species, that's a staghorn coral, and which can be thick and dense and very deep if you try and burrow down through it to get to what's down at the bottom of the coral. It can be extremely thick and hard to get. But if there's really strong wave action, as you get with anything approaching cyclonic winds, of course, most of that coral will be wiped out. It's brittle and rather fragile under such conditions, and it will spread. It doesn't mean it's the end of it, of course, because the little bits of coral, being actually colonies of animals formed, consisting of corals of animals and their skeleton that they lay down, can take root, if they're lucky, in a suitable place that's not too sandy, and start to grow into another colony. And this regeneration of the coral reefs is extremely important, particularly in the Abrolhos. We do get corals coming up, of course, along the coast here, but they're usually in just clumps. They're not forming reefs in general, well, hardly ever, in my knowledge, anyhow. But there are coral colonies which expand in good conditions and retract in poor conditions as far as they're concerned. Thank you. So that here we have two relatively different sorts of environments: the coastal environment and the offshore coral-dominated environment. The corals, by the way, are not just the corals. The corals of the Abrolhos shouldn't be thought of as just the corals that are there living right now. They're the corals that have been there for past centuries because, well, at least back until about 10,000 years ago, and we presume before, but the geologists can tell you a lot more about that later on. The coral, the substrate of the coral is turned into limestone, and it's really quite hard and permanent. And even if if a really bad cyclone comes down, which doesn't happen very often, of course, and it wipes off most of the living coral from that base or rock, the coral will regenerate and come back, provided other conditions are similar. And the conditions, of course, that are necessary are largely that it should be the right temperature. So it still depends on that Leeuwin Current coming down and encircling the Abrolhos Islands to keep the temperature at a condition, at a stage where the corals can develop and grow. Right, next one, thanks. So out on the Abrolhos we have various different sorts of habitats, the ones we have here. This is just a small coral bommy, only about, that size, but it's anchored to the rocky reef, the dead coral around it. And this particular coral grows in a sort of lumpy fashion. The lumpy fashion is partly due to these scallops. They're a type of scallop that living in between in the crevices of that particular coral. This is a close-up picture of one of those scallops. It's a way out scallop, but it is one. And they must have a sort of they must grow in sequence. They grow at about the same rate. So the coral, if the coral grew too fast, would cover over the scallop, and the scallop would be smothered. On the other hand, if the scallop grew too fast, it would bulge out of this sheltering nook, and it would be eaten by fish. So there has to be a balance there between the growth of the two types of organisms. Thank you. Some other creatures, other tropical species of molluscs. This is an arc shell here. It settles down, but it doesn't it doesn't seem to live very often in living coral. It'll live on the coral rock that's there, and it'll get in as a tiny larva into a crevice and wedge itself in, and provided it has enough room to open its valves, it's upside down, so this is the bottom part of it. The valves open out that way, and it just enough, it only needs to open up to be able to get the water current that its gills generate dragged in, bringing in the plankton that it feeds upon. But it's well protected, as you can see, very little. That probably is all in about one plane, just about. And so fish and so on just can't get at it. And even octopus would find it very difficult to cope with that particular sort of protective mechanism. Thank you. But when we come back to the coastal waters on seagrass, such as this Posidonia that we saw in the other picture of the seagrass beds, we find creatures that are dependent on that seagrass. They can't live on rock, they can't live on coral, they certainly can't live on sand. One of them is this little chiton. It's only a tiny little thing, or goes to 2 or 3 centimetres at the greatest. It's a chiton. That means that it hasn't got 2 shells like a bivalve, or 1 shell like a cowrie shell or a cone shell. It has 8 little shells along here, along its back, so that it can bend, so it can adapt itself to whatever the topography of the surface it's growing on. And it goes along and rasps off all the sponge on the outside of the seagrass leaf and lives there quite happily, and that is the only place where it can live. So that there are similar sorts of things on the western coast of the United States, in California and places like that, where there has been a great deal of erosion and poisoning from runoff from the land of the seagrass beds there. And a little creature like this, very similar to this one, is is about the only one that is so far known to have become extinct on that coast because of the deterioration of the seagrass beds. This is just one example of, really, to point home the message of how important these seagrass beds can be, either to permanent dwellers like this little chiton, or to the temporary dwellers like the larval fish or crabs or rock lobsters. Next one, please. Along the coast, of course, you'd have to get most of the organisms that live there have to be able to cope with the sand and the sediment in general being stirred up. And one of these it's not a terribly good picture. It actually looked better when I looked at the slide, but it's got these mussels here. Here's one of them that's there and open. It's taking in the water. Its gills are creating the current that takes the water in. And in that current, not only is it supplying it with oxygen, but it's supplying it with the food from the plankton. But those little mussels can live in such a situation because they can cope with the sediment that's around them. Of course, the sediment's going to get washed up. They can close quickly. If they close reasonably quickly, they won't have any sediment falling inside and glugging up their gills. But if they don't do it so quickly, they can accumulate water, and they clap their valves together and make a great spurt, and out they push a bit like us spitting, I suppose. They spit out all the sediment that's likely to cause problems. And it's not every creature that can do that. And so creatures that can't do that sort of thing, clearing themselves of the sediment, are not going to live in a place like the coastal waters around here. Thank you. One of the tropical species that's much more common as you get right up in the northern reefs and islands of off Western Australia is this particular oyster, which lives on rock. It's a fairly largish oyster, about so big at its greatest, and it has solved this problem of sediment and predators getting inside where all the meat is, inside the shells. So it's formed these ridges on its shell, which it does gradually as it grows. They become more angular. And so it only has to open its valves up just a little bit to allow quite a lot of water to be able to enter in, to be pulled in by its gills action, supplying food and so on. So there's no way that a crab or a fish or any other predator of that sort can get at the innards of this particular oyster through that tiny little crack. It also has almost always, in fact every case that I've ever seen, has this sponge growing on it. It's a sort of a mutual cooperative society. And the sponge, as in most sponges, would secrete sometimes, certainly noxious substances that would put off anything trying to bite off the oyster, but sometimes quite poisonous substances which would deter predators from trying to eat the oyster by crushing it. Thank you. Whereas plankton feeders on the southern coast of Australia, coming around the corner of Cape Leeuwin, Cape Naturalist, and up the coast about as far, and around about Geraldton, just a little bit south of Geraldton, is about as far north as we've ever found them living, these blue mussels which live along that stretch. And they are plankton feeders too, but they mostly require fairly clear water in which to breed. They haven't got this function developed of being able to squirt out water rapidly to get rid of sediment and so on. And they certainly live in places where there tends to be plenty of plankton on which they feed. These blue mussels only live for about a year. They grow very rapidly, so they must have a good food supply in order to be able to grow rapidly. And then they get a bit heavy sometimes, and then they fall off and get smothered by the sand or sediment that's down below them. Thank you. Because the molluscs, for instance, and all other creatures that I haven't mentioned too well, are feeding in different ways. They tend to be able to divide. They tend to be able to be more species, more closely related species, so that in the scallop family, for instance, there's a great diversity because they have been able to adapt themselves to quite minor changes in the habitats that are available. This is another tropical species that's come down. It can gape very widely here and open its valves right up and get a tremendous amount of water coming through and food coming through, so that they grow very rapidly. Which is particularly important where water is not so heavily laden with plankton. As I mentioned before, no, I didn't. I meant to. The corals, of course, are competing with creatures like this. The corals are eating plankton too. They don't suck it in. They have their tentacles that come out with these little stinging cells on the tentacles, and they zap the plankton that comes in contact, and then they bring their tentacles in and lick the plankton off their tentacles, and then they put them out again. And so all that coral that's growing out at the Abrolhos is a plankton feeder too. And so they have all the creatures that are there have to be able to survive that sort of competition from a completely different sort of organisms. Thank you. One of the creatures that does do that, and it's found on the inshore waters largely along here, it does occur a little bit out on the Abrolhos, are these wormshells. Now you can't actually see it, but it's a sort of a wormy shape. It's like a tube that's gone wrong, and it curls around. Sometimes it curls around like that. Sometimes it just curls around whatever space is available. And this is the end of the tube here, and it's got a little operculum, a little horny operculum that it can close itself off because it doesn't want to get eaten by crabs and such that are walking around there. But what it does is secrete mucus, and all this spongy-looking stuff are threads of mucus that the worm shell has secreted, and it's sticky mucus. And while it's out there, all sorts of things, sediment, but also the plankton will stick to it. You know, if it comes in contact, it's like old-fashioned fly paper that we used to have hanging in our houses in the olden days. And what it does is it gets, when it's active, it will pull in these strings of mucus and swallow them, swallowing its own mucus, but all the stuff that's stuck to it. So that's how it can enlarge its range. From such a small animal, it can feed over quite a big area around it. Thank you. A different sort of organism altogether is this one, which is a carnivore. This is the giant conch. It's the largest living gastropod in the world. It grows, the biggest ones, I suppose, would be about so big. You don't see them very often at all, but they are the really biggest things. They grow. Australia is a good place, particularly Western Australia is a very good place for these sorts of animals. It's a carnivore. It burrows. It can burrow through sand. It can crawl up over rocks and reefs and so on. But along the coast here, it's in some places, or it was, very abundant. Not so abundant now because people gather them, because they, of course, get caught up in storms and get washed up and so on. People gather them to make lampshades out of and all sorts of things like that. And also because of the fishing industries, particularly those that are dragging nets across the bottom, like the prawn fishers or other similar fishermen. And the prawn nets will catch up the egg masses of these particular, this giant false conch or giant conch. The egg masses are about the size of, somewhere about the size of a football, or a column about the length of a football. And they're made up, the egg mass is horny, particularly when it gets dry, when it's thrown up on the beaches. You might find them occasionally. It becomes very brittle, but down in the water it's much more flexible. It's made up of a number of plates sitting on top of one another with little retaining walls in between. And the eggs are deposited on each of these little plates as the animal goes through the sequence of laying the eggs. Each of the eggs has some yolk in it, in fact quite a bit of yolk, and if that egg mass survives and doesn't get ripped off by a net or a cyclone or something like that, then the little ones will hatch, and they hatch to be little tiny shells about 2 centimetres, around about 2 centimetres, 2.5 centimetres long. And they get out and they go off from their parent. The parent's not around. The parent doesn't look after this egg mass, just goes off doing its own thing. And the little ones will go off into the sand or onto the rocks and start living on what they can find themselves. And what they are looking for are mostly creatures like bivalves, things that burrow in the sand. The reason that the conch and its young have this long tube at the front, and you'll know other sorts of molluscs that have a similar tube, is because they have a siphon that comes out, and they're protecting the siphon, which is a muscular tube, and the animal pulls in, the gills of the animal pull in the water current through here, up into here, and just in there, in about that sort of spot, is an organ of smell or taste. It's a bit hard to put a proper word to this organ of chemical sense. And they can smell their prey, and so they are very good. They're looking mostly for molluscs. These even, like the baler shells, these even do eat abalone, but this particular one is mostly after bivalves that are burrowing, that are down in the sand. And so they're quite significant predators. They're sort of getting towards the top of the food web. Some people have referred to them as being something in the same position of tigers. You know, there are these tigers up the top of their food chain, and if the numbers of tigers are diminished, then the rest of the food chain has to change dramatically, and the same is true of these things. So a loss of these animals along the coast would be would cause a good deal of change in the whole environment and habitats that we have here. Thank you. This is a terrible slide. I hadn't realised it was going to come up so poorly. It's an octopus, actually. It's an octopus, and you can, if you look very, very closely, you can see 3 of its arms projecting out here. The arms, the other 5 arms would be underneath all this mass, which is a cloud of ink that the octopus has just expelled, which in a moment or two after that was taken would have just dissipated. And in the meantime, the octopus would have changed because it felt threatened. That was the only reason it put out this ink. And because in a moment or two that ink would have started to disperse, and so the octopus would change its colour. It would become almost about the colour of this rubble and sand that's around it, and it would shoot off in the other direction by a jet propulsion sort of action, or crawl into a crevice if there was one handy, and would no longer be in the danger it thought it was in. In fact, it wasn't in any danger at this particular time because we were just looking at it. But it felt that it was pretty vulnerable. It has been seeking food. It's been crawling over this substrate of algae and rubble and sand, and has been searching for food. It's mostly finding its food by putting its tentacles down into the crevices and under the clumps of algae and so on. The suckers along the arms are actually, each of them, supplied with an organ of chemical sense, like I was telling you before, of taste or smell. And so it's actually sort of sniffing out, if I can use that inadequate word, for prey, mostly crabs and the like, down in these crevices. And that's why they crawl along, put their tentacles down, and sort of feeling what's down there, and if it's worthwhile, then they'll wedge themselves down to get the prey. Thank you. And another closely related organism is the cuttlefish. This is one of the cuttlefish. Cuttlefish sort of come in two sorts. There are the oceanic ones and the inshore ones. And then there's even another division. There's the ones that are solitary and others that go around in a group, like a school. And this is one of the solitary inshore ones that is along the coast here and much further to the south, around the bottom of Australia, and so on. And it is a large it can be a large cuttlefish. It can grow almost to 1 metre in length, of body length, from the tip of its tentacles down to the tip of its tail. And it has those very large cuttle bones that you might find, often up to about that size, that are washed up on the shore. The cuttle bone is in under this area just along here. It's like a bit of a skeleton. The muscles pull against it, just as our muscles pull against our spine, and it allows the movement, or very strong movement. The movement that it mostly uses is the flaps along the side, and it undulates them and just goes along very gently. If it wants to move fast, it takes in a gulp of water into its the cavity underneath this area here, and then squirts it out through a tunnel and can back off, just like the octopus can, by jet propulsion, very fast. And this cuttlefish would be looking for its prey. It's solitary in general, except when the mating season comes around, and they just wander around and among these reefs that we have inshore and in these weed beds, looking for their prey. They eat a variety of things, right from small fish to crustaceans of various sorts. Particularly, cuttlefish in general don't eat molluscs like some of the octopus do. Thank you. Another way in which another aspect of the animal's lives, which allows all these species, and I can only show you, of course, a tiny little bit of it. You'll just have to take my word for it that there are a tremendous number of species of molluscs along these coasts. Another way in which they can all live together is that they have and survive when there's a lot of competition for food and space, when there's a lot of predators waiting to eat them and so on, is by developing different ways of reproduction. Of particular importance when we were talking about, as I mentioned before, when we were talking about the currents, is the reproduction type that is typical of most of the bivalves and some of the gastropods, and that is producing a large, males and females, each males will produce a huge number of sperm, females not quite so many, but still a huge number of eggs, and they will just spit them out into the water. If we could have the next slide, please. An example of a gastropod that does that sort of thing are the abalone. This is a tropical abalone species that lives over on the Abrolhos, but is much more abundant up in the northern regions of Australia and on into the central Indo-Pacific. In fact, there's an industry in the Philippines gathering it for food these days, and you can see why it would be quite good. All this tissue around the outside, they're little tiny tentacles, feelers, that would be organs of smell, contain organs of smell. And these particular sort of abalone hides in crevices during the day mostly. It's good sense because it would be so vulnerable if it was out in the open. Comes out at night in general and walks around and abrades the rock and eats the algae that grows on the rock, just like as do the abalone that we're more familiar with along our southern coasts. When it breeds, it doesn't mate. What usually happens is that the males release their sperm first into the water, and perhaps because of a chemical acting as a chemical trigger, the females will then release all their eggs. And so hopefully you'll get all these eggs and sperm mixing up together, and there will at least be some chance that a fair number of them will meet, and the eggs will be fertilised and start developing into planktonic larvae. How am I going for time? Another creature that does that, another set of creatures that do it, are the nudibranchs, the sea slugs they're often called, unfortunately, because they mostly look much better than the land slugs that we're more familiar with. And these do much the same sort of thing, only they lay all their eggs into a jelly-like mass, which often can be quite large, and which they cement onto the rocks for stability. The difference here is that the sea hares, the nudibranchs, are hermaphrodites. They have both male and female reproductive systems within their own each body, but they don't fertilise their own eggs. They fertilise one another's eggs, and they often get together in numbers, so that occasionally, and I have seen it down at Geraldton actually, in the days when you could get round to the jetty piles in the harbour, and seen these huge numbers of the same sort of nudibranch gathered together, and presumably this is leading on to their reproductive stage and the release and the laying of the egg masses. Thank you. But we do have others where there's a greater care taken of the young, and they don't have to then have this more chancy method of just broadcasting their young into the water. They can either take some means of protecting their eggs, or they can look after them. Next one, thanks. This is a picture of two of these little dumpling squid who normally live under the sand with just their eyes showing up above the level of the sand, so they can grab a prawn or a shrimp, some sort of thing like that, as it comes along, as they can see it, very clear eyesight. These have had to come up, presumably, to mate. I suppose they can't mate underneath the sand. And I would guess that maybe that lighter colour one is the male and this one's the female, simply because that happens in other groups that we know more about. And the female will lay little eggs, each with a fair amount of yolk in it, in a little bunch attached to a piece of seagrass. Next one, thanks. Another, like the giant conch, the false conch, as I said before, this is one of the Pleura shells, one of the bigger species that we have along our coast. That Pleura shell could be sort of something of that length, and the foot obviously much larger, and those lay a horny sort of egg mass again, like the giant conches, with very yolky eggs, and the young hatch and are able not only to, well, they have to fend for themselves as soon as they hatch, but they are able to burrow under the sand and get protection that way. Next one, thank you. But molluscs are not only concerned with looking after their young, but they also have to find ways themselves of surviving, and they take this different ways of doing this. Next one, thanks. Some of them have thick shells, like this giant clam. We have giant clams much more typical of the tropical areas, but they do come down to the Abrolhos. I think they do dribble down the coast in certain places, but they're much more abundant. Well, couple of species are much more abundant on the Abrolhos. And they have this thick shell, which is really, once it closes, nothing could get at the tissue inside it. They don't actually close all that quickly. They give a jerk and then they close a bit more slowly. And so the films that we used to see of people getting their legs caught in giant clams are not very likely. Thank you. Other shells, like this spider shell, have these great pointy spines sticking out. Not only does that keep them fairly stable on the ground when there's a lot of water movement, but it also deters would-be predators, maybe like fish or whatever, from grabbing it, because obviously they'd get it stuck in their throat and be a bit off-putting. Thank you. The Pleura brank, this is a different sort of sea slug, a different group. These produce really noxious substances in the glands of their skin. This particular one, we've had one of our staff members encounter it a while back, and it lifted one. There's sea slugs around about that size, and picking it up in his hand, he was aware that something was odd. He put it down, and very quickly all his skin became inflamed, and eventually it all peeled off from his whole palm of his hand and his fingers. And obviously, if you were a would-be predator in their natural environment, you'd hesitate at exposing yourself to that sort of danger. Thank you. The octopus, this particular octopus is one that's, again, along the coast, but I haven't actually seen it on the Abrolhos. I'm not sure if it gets there. Certainly along the coastal areas, goes on the reefs that tend to be exposed at low tide. And it gets up there. That's where this photograph was taken, just with a little bit of water covering that octopus. It can take in this huge amount of water into its mantle cavity, like I mentioned before, and squirt it out through a funnel. But it has the ability to squirt it at what it thinks is its predator. So that was what was happening when this photograph was taken. The person coming there was getting up close, and this squirt of water, quite a strong squirt of water, came out absolutely accurately and hit the photographer. And so it moved around a bit, and another squirt came up and hit the photographer there. So it was really, it's using its eyes, and it's using this squirt of water as a deterrent to any would-be predators that are around. Thank you. And of the same ilk of these cephalopods, octopus, squid and cuttlefish that we've been talking about, the blue-ringed octopus. This is a tropical species that does come down. I have found it up at Drummond Cove in years past when I've been holding reef walks and things like that, and it was quite abundant there at the time. And we can tell it's one of the tropical species because of the pattern of rings on the body there. Most of the southern ones, instead of having rings there, they might have rings around this part, the top of their tentacles, but these will be more streaks and so on, and they're usually much smaller. This is a larger one. And these blue-ringed octopus have in their salivary glands, they have colonies of bacteria, which has recently been found as producing a venom which the octopus uses to pacify it, and for these ones paralyse their prey and kill their prey actually very quickly. And so they're making use of this symbiotic organism living in their salivary glands to manufacture the venom that they use to catch their own prey. Their own prey usually being crabs and things like that, but they of course can use it on fish. I have seen one, and other creatures like fish. I have seen one in Broome in an aquarium killing a sea snake, leaping onto the sea snake. I'd been watching it a while before. The octopus was on the side of the tank. The sea snake was just wandering around. It was a big sea snake, about so long, about that thick, and I walked away to talk to someone. A kid called out, "Oh, look, it's jumped on the sea snake," and it did. And by the time I got across the room, which is about from here to the back of the room here, the sea snake was dead, just like that. And so it's no wonder that people like rock lobster fishermen and so on get a bit nervy when they feel something crawling up their leg that's come out of the cray pots as they're pulling them up and so on, because they really are quite venomous. Although as kids, I remember when I was at university and we used to go out on beach walks and the older ones would demonstrate to the younger ones all this variety of sea creatures around. We used to put them on our arms, give them a poke and say, look at the blue rings flashing out. Fortunately, none of us got bitten. I think that's the end, isn't it? Right. Thank you.